Hello everyone. Over the last couple of episodes, we have talked about the Spanish invasion, and in regards to historians and the perspectives that they take, there have been a number of different interpretations as to exactly what the Spanish conquest meant. A dominant theme in many histories is that the Spanish conquest was one of destruction and loss. That ultimately the contact between the Europeans and indigenous Americans resulted in the destruction of Mexica culture and the ruination of their civilization. This is a view which perpetuates the idea of loss, and in many ways also corruption. Basically, before the arrival of the Europeans, the Mexicans lived in some sort of Avatar-esque utopian paradise. Now on the opposite side, you have another narrative which we have analyzed in several episodes, a narrative which we have identified as a result of essentially Spanish propaganda. This is the idea that the Mexican people and Mexican civilization were a bunch of backwards savages, oppressed peoples who were crying out for a liberator, and that liberator came in the form of the Spanish as directed by God. And the Spanish were directed to spread Western and Christian civilization around the world, according to them. In more recent times, you have historians who try to balance these perspectives, who do not wish to downplay the horrors of conquest, but also at the same time does not want to portray the indigenous people as solely victims, a perspective which also recognizes their role in facilitating the Spanish conquest. This is the idea that the Mexicans saw some benefit to cooperating with the Spanish Empire. Therefore, they chose to uphold Spanish ways of living because they saw that the benefits for them outweighed the cons. In this regard, the Mexican people were co-creators of an international, world-spanning Spanish Empire. Keep in mind that the indigenous peoples consistently outnumbered the Spanish. They could have kicked the Spanish out at any moment if they had chosen, and as they eventually do, but they did not. And I think that this is the most rational perspective, because the Mexican people were also victims, yeah, but they are also fully human, with all the resulting human complexities and nuances. Indeed, not all indigenous Americans experienced the Spanish conquest in exactly the same way. We have seen previously how the Tlaxcalans were a major ally for the Spaniards. And for their loyalty, they were granted protections for their ancestral lands, along with being exempt from the slavery that Spain was imposing elsewhere throughout the Americas. So in many ways, the Spanish conquest was both destructive and at the same time creative. Perhaps the greatest example of this cooperation to create a new order is best exemplified in the Virgin of Guadalupe. Both the indigenous Americans and the Spaniards derived a nationalistic interpretation of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Now, the Virgin had deep roots in Spanish culture, being part of the Catholic tradition which the Spaniards drew upon. And during the Reconquista, Spain essentially reconfigured the Virgin Mary to essentially be a sort of Christianized Athena. Keep in mind that Athena was the ancient Greek goddess of wisdom and warfare. She was a supreme tactician who guided countless heroes to their triumphs. In fact, many of the victories during the Reconquista were attributed to the intervention of the Virgin. She, as a sort of heavenly general, ensured their triumph over the Moors. Take, for example, Hernán Cortés's chaplain, Francisco López de Gomara. He personally considered his military intervention in the American hemisphere as a continuation of the Reconquista. And as a result, he applied this image of the Virgin Mary general that was used in Spain, he applied it to the battles in the American hemisphere. In describing one of the battles, he claimed that the General Mary used dust to blind the eyes of Spain's opponents, ensuring Spanish victory. Indeed, for the Spanish, the Virgin of Guadalupe was not only representative of a military victory, but a cultural and spiritual victory as well. Indeed, many historians have argued that the Spanish, particularly the Franciscans, were adept at using elements of Mexica culture to essentially reconfigure, Hispanicize, and sell back to the Mexican people, essentially using aspects of indigenous culture, making them Catholic, as a means to make Catholicism easier to spread, to make the indigenous peoples easier to convert. During the process of exorcism and destroying the pagan temples, while this was taking place, the Franciscans would do things such as leaving Catholic symbols such as statues at the exact same places of pagan worship to create an association between Catholicism and the pre-Spanish paganistic religion of the Mexican people. Thus, for many Spaniards and many historians have seen the Virgin of Guadalupe as essentially proof that the Spanish were master manipulators able to bend the Mexica people to their will. And many Spanish believe that it represented the ultimate triumph of Catholicism in a new world. Yet for the Mexica people, the Virgin of Guadalupe also represented a triumph, not a militaristic one, but a triumph of the human spirit. Our story begins with Juan Diego Tonantzin, who was a recently converted Nahua to the Catholic faith. Now, the story goes that on the way to Mass, he passed the hill of Tepeyac. This was the location in which the Aztecs, before the Europeans, worshipped their mother goddess. Apparently, he had heard music so enthralling he could not help but follow. Following, he finds a beautiful and radiant lady. She revealed her identity as the Virgin Mary of Christ. And she also ordered Juan Diego to ask the bishop to build a new temple on this very location. Now, Juan Diego tried 3 times to convince the bishop of what he saw, and each time he had failed. He returned to the hill. She then instructed him that at the top of a certain hill, there will be Spanish roses of European origin growing miraculously in the middle of winter. Juan Diego collected the roses, once again went to the bishop and revealed the roses to the bishop, and at that moment, the Virgin of Guadalupe also reveals herself. With the bishop converted, he invites Juan Diego to stay overnight in the palace and orders the construction of a new Christian temple, exactly as Juan Diego and the Virgin asked. Now, to deconstruct this story a little bit, this story basically represents the idea that the indigenous were able to draw concessions from the Spanish rulers. At first, the Spanish refused to listen to Juan Diego, but when Juan Diego proved his Catholicism and his faith to such an extent, the Spanish caved in. Thus, many indigenous peoples have interpreted the story of the Virgin of Guadalupe as a restoration of Mexican power, of indigenous power. Now, to understand this deeper, we need to go a little bit back to before the arrival of the Spanish. Before the arrival of the Spanish, the sanctuary at Tepeyac was known as the Sanctuary of Tonantzin, which the Mexican people translated as Our Dear Mother Lady Serpent. And for the Aztecs, she was the goddess and mother of the human race. She was an earth goddess, a moon goddess, a goddess of fertility. She was the feminine counterpart to the male spirit. Whereas the male spirit was one of war, death, and destruction, she was one of survival, regeneration, and life. In short, the Virgin of Guadalupe was a symbol of hope. When the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared at the exact same location as Tonantzin, it represented a continuity not only of gods, but of the indigenous people themselves. Keep in mind that the Spanish military conquest resulted in the widespread exorcism of Mexican civilization, the destruction of their peoples, and a whole bunch of violence that entailed. Thus, for the Virgin of Guadalupe to appear to an indigenous person, not a European Spanish person, but to an indigenous person at the exact same site as Tonantzin's sacred site, both represented a continuity and survival of the indigenous peoples. She was the ancestral protector of the Mexica people who, in their time of need, returned. For many, she represented the idea that the only way they were able to survive the brutality of Spanish conquest was because of her. The Virgin of Guadalupe gave them a source of hope, that the future could be brighter, than the world that had ended with the arrival of the Spanish. In short, the Virgin of Guadalupe was a mother goddess, and the mother goddess protects. Moreover, the fact that the Virgin of Guadalupe reveals herself specifically to an indigenous person, who then gets a European Spaniard to go along with the revelation, illustrates the idea that the indigenous peoples were every bit as equally worthy as the Spanish. That God did not play favorites. God saw his children, both European Spanish and indigenous American, as equally deserving. Indeed, this was the reason why some Spaniards were not at all pleased that the supposedly new converts to Catholicism were worshiping at the exact same site as they did in pagan times. There's many Spaniards who complained about this obvious blasphemy to Christianity. For them, it looked like absolute heresy. But moreover, the Virgin of Guadalupe for the Mexican nation essentially represents a visual form of Christian nationalism. The Virgin of Guadalupe linked Christian identity and national identity so close together that it's impossible to separate these two elements. Basically, the idea that one cannot be Mexican without also being Catholic. But this combination of national identity and religious identity would anticipate future events, particularly when the English settlers at Plymouth Rock merged the idea of creating a new nation that was also a Christian nation. This idea of national identity mixing with religious identity is something we can see throughout the American hemisphere, and it's something we can see in our present time, still resonating throughout American culture.